Mic check. Can you guys hear me? All right, perfect.
Okay. All right. Okay. Here we go. I have to introduce you so that you know when to start. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I know I don't really need to introduce Ed again because this is his second sustainability seminar that he's doing for us. But I do want to just say thank you for doing another one on making decisions in an uncertain world.
It's actually really a
Part 2.
confession of a practitioner. That
Okay.
should be the title. But
Okay.
anyway.
Good, we got that recorded. So Ed's here visiting us from the EPA and has a lot of great insight for researchers, students, and so forth. We'll see who he introduces up to sit in the fancy green chairs, if anyone, so pay attention. And then he also has candy, which some people have already been able to get some of. But otherwise, I won't do a big, long intro, and I'll just hand it over to you.
That's enough introduction.
Well, do you want questions throughout or at the end?
I'm happy to entertain questions, but I'm going to try to get through it very quickly. Yeah. So Josh said we should really have a conversation about the topic. So we'll try to do that.
Sounds good.
That's also why there's chocolates, because we want you to be stimulated. And so those of you who need more, just tell me. So to begin with, I think, how many of you actually came to my first seminar? Okay, so there's some memory of that. I'm sure you try to forget it, but then the idea was I try to set this up as a follow-up to that conversation. And one of the things that I always talk about before I get started is, I'm a practitioner. I am not one of you who are going to school or have done research in, sort of your area of expertise for decades. But I have been practicing. And what I always call, when people say, especially with my family, it's hard to explain what I do. So I always tell people that I try to make the best decisions to have a biggest impact on sustainability, right? And so, as I speak with everyone here, a lot of the conversations surround, at least for me, what I've been learning about myself and what I do for a living is that a lot of the decisions that I make are really made with less than perfect information, I would say. And now for today, I wanted to kind of talk about not just less than perfect information, but is the decision-making framework in sustainability is that even something close to perfection? So whenever someone says sustainability, I think about words like harmony with nature, balance with nature. But can we ever get to nirvana? Right? That's the question that I ask. And then I start thinking about, okay, so what do I do at EPA from day to day? So that's what I'm going to kind of, it's very nebulous, but please follow along with me this afternoon, and we can talk more about that. So I say that this is a confession, or confessions of a public servant, because I'm going to share with you how imperfect decision-making is at federal agencies like EPA, and why it's really difficult for us to think about sustainability nirvana, right? It is extremely difficult, I would say. And before I get started, though, I do have to say, today's conversation, because it's a confession, the views are my own only, not ASU or EPA. So this is truly a personal confession today. So I want to just start, those of you who are starting out in your career, to talk about the fact that there are two things that I know is not true that I used to believe. And people asked me about this while I've been here is, one is, I actually believed when I started in my career that I could work myself out of a job. Okay, 40 years ago, I've been working at EPA 30 out of its 50-year history. And I thought as a young kid that, no longer, but as a young kid that, hey, EPA does not have to exist. we could actually reach sustainability nirvana, that you don't have to worry about negative impacts of pollution, that we could actually solve this problem in my lifetime. How naive was that? Because I actually think that it may never be solved. That's what today's conversation about. The second thing that I would always say to people, and I still, even a few years ago, I would say to people at EPA, hey, the decisions that we make actually are not as important as what Department of Defense does, because it doesn't kill people. Well, if you were here, you talked about the heat resiliency, 650 people died this last year, right? 645 here because of heat problems. How? Maricopa County only, right? How many people died because of the hurricane in North Carolina and Florida? So absolutely heartbreaking. And so the sustainability world, it's not just theoretical or systemic thinking, right? It actually now with climate impacts, it is having a real impact on actually people dying from it, right? And that gets close to home, right, for me, because it's not just personal decisions that I make, but I actually make decisions that affect lives of people, health of people, animals, let's not forget that, and biodiversity. The bottom line is that this is a really important field, and how we make decisions, I think, from a sustainability perspective, in my opinion, that we really need to be introspective about and think about what is a way that we're being taught or we teach people, is this the right kind of framing? That's what I wanted to talk about a bit today. So let me step way back. I look at the globe. The reason that I wanted to have the picture up there is that, let me just say that in 1984, so I'm confessing my vintage now, 1984, when I graduated from, when I got my bachelor's degree, there were 4.8 billion people in the world. Today, you guys know the number? 8.2 billion people. 40 years, 2 generations, right? In the United States, in 1984, 236 million people. In 1984, now 345 million people. You wonder why air traffic is so congested. You wonder why when you go, there's a line everywhere. There was a time when I went to Disney World, I could actually walk onto a ride, right, without actually paying more to get in line. I'm confessing that I also go to Disney World there. But here's the thing. I want you to realize that the gross domestic product in the United States in that time period grew from $12.5 trillion to $29 trillion. We've gotten wealthier with more people, right? And that's just the prosperity part of it. We're better off, and I'll talk more about that. And guess what? We live longer. So the reason I'm talking about this is that we have just, people don't talk about the population growth because we as human beings have done so well in trying to get more out of Mother Earth. Because if you look at the globe, Earth has not changed. I don't mean that, just a flippant way, but the resources have not changed, right? We're using the resources, right? But how are we getting more out of Mother Earth? I just want you to think about that. We're getting more out of Mother Earth because, I would argue, that we're just ingenious people. We innovate and we created stuff. Stuff. You're sitting on stuff. We're no longer sitting on wood trunks. Look at the nice furniture you're sitting in. What's it made out of? Nothing natural. It's everywhere. Carpeting. So food, how do you provide food and nutrition enough for a population that's doubled? You've got to ask that question, right? So you guys like visuals. So do you guys look at the world data? I have to show you this just to kind of illustrate my point that I'm just not making this up. So if you look at the food supply, so this is the how much calories available from food supply, right? So I have the time lapse. The greener it gets, more calories are available for people. By the way, this is a great website. If you guys don't have this, Our World in Data, there's a lot of information about the patterns in the world in terms of how we live. So look at how it's improved. Almost everyone in the world now, significant amount of food is available to people in our lifetime. So I was born in 1962, and this is from 1961 that I just showed you. And at the same time, look at the land use. We use less land now to produce that amount of food for people who've grown, doubled in size. The globe has doubled in size. Wealth. This is sort of wealth of countries that shows whether we can actually afford to buy the food that we need. Just incredible amount of ingenuity, as well as prosperity that we've created for ourselves. So I'll get to Michael Crow. I always say that, I always like to talk about my boss at least once during the lecture. He talks about this, right? He says, our university academic, all of us have contributed and continue to higher education, research through innovation in policy and technology, creation of products. We continue to do better for all of us. But here's the thing. We've never found a place of balance, right? We have constantly created negative externalities. This did not come without cost. Climate change is the number one thing, right? I can talk about many, many decisions that EPA made. I mean, and I'll talk about PFAS in a little while. But the bottom line is, none of these things that we've done, and people talk about polluters, those polluters, other than the ones who are actually violating the law, they've created pesticides, herbicides, coal-fired power plants that work well because you can have energy. All these things were done for humankind, but created negative outcomes. And that's what I want us to kind of start off with. So the reason that by the way, this is a life expectancy chart. So this is in 1980. So watch what happens when you get to the color changing to blue. Basically, that shows how much it's improved since 1962. 1962 is the year that I was born. It's pretty much helped everyone in the world. 4 additional billions of people that we have in the world, we've improved their lives, right? Same thing with energy. Energy use, is it available? This is in 1965. I'm going to start. There's disparities, but everyone on average have benefited from our progress. So the reason that I'm pointing this out is that the cost of it is pretty significant. So everybody talks about plastics. So let's talk about plastic. In the same time period, we've improved everything. We've improved people's lives because of things like plastic, right? Very harmful to the environment now, both in terms of production, ecological outcomes, and human health outcomes now. Someone just told me that, I have 2 credit cards worth of plastics in my system. Someone else could verify that. So I think there's a huge understanding, I think, in a sustainability world that we need to accept is that these were choices now that we made were not unintentional. The movie Oppenheimer, there's this fake scene where when the test is successful, somebody one of the scientists saying, I think crying or, for the consequence. Well, that's, as President Crow said, that's crazy. They knew what they were doing. We know that when we place a garbage sanitation transfer station in a certain neighborhood, we know exactly what we're doing, why it's there, and not instead of Scottsdale. Trade-offs, right? So we're all part of that. Agreed? Okay, so there was no controversy about so far that what I've talked about? So in theory, at least in my mind, that in a sustainable world that we're talking about, that the growth of all this should be done in a way without these consequences, right? That's the nirvana that we're shooting for. But is that possible in our current framing, current decision-making process? And I would just want to, for the sake of discussion, and Josh said I should do this for the sake of discussion, that I would argue that we're never going to get out of this cycle because of the way that in the Western world of way of thinking about this and how we have to make choices. What we're all learning has put boundaries around us, including me, and I've been doing this for 40 years. And but historically, now looking back at those 40 years, it's caused this. And I would argue that it continues to cause this. Why is it acceptable for us to have 645 people die in Maricopa County every year? I would argue that we allow that because we accept that as a cost of all the other benefits that we have. It's just a fact because people are dying, right? And people talk about resiliency, but we've made choices where we have decided that this is somehow okay. All the individual choices add up to this, right? So the whole idea of sustainability systems thinking, I think, is at question here in my mind. By the way, I'm just doing this for the sake of argument, so you guys will have a chance to talk about this. There are unknown consequences. I agree with that. But I would argue almost all the negative impacts that we've seen now were known consequences, that we made a choice to accept those costs because the benefits were so great, right? So let me just tell you how at EPA, for instance, we make decisions, right? So people all say EPA is an organization of science and law. I say that all the time. Every institution in a democratic society should be a transparent institution that says, here's the science, here's what we know, here are the facts. And the laws govern how we interpret those facts, and we have a great outcome, right? Great idealistic world. So in reality, so I kind of wrote down, what do I usually consider? So of course, science is important, but let's talk about science first and foremost, and law. So what is the definition of science? 8th grade. Someone want to say something about this? Do you guys even remember what the definition of science is? Scientists, all of you? Oh, I need more candy. So it is a search for information and facts about our life and our world, right? But the challenge that the science poses to us is that we're continuously trying to search for answers. And we have not found them in everywhere, right? So every time we talk about science, it's not a static or a final answer. What I know today is very different than what I knew yesterday. What I know today is very different than what we knew in 1962. You would agree with that, right? So even the word people use, science, to justify decisions, I would urge you to kind of think about. So when we do risk assessments, for instance, on a chemical, do we ever do human testing? No. Do we do testing on animals? Maybe. Do we do testing on animals that are even close to us? No. How then do we assess what the cancer risk is to us? I think you should ask that question. I'm not going to answer that because I can tell you what that's all about. But this is a really important thing, right? How does it affect? So science, none of you should take it as a answer that is a definitive, and the regulatory agencies. Okay, regulatory agencies. Here, just give her the kind of, yeah. So let me just throw that into the mix, right? I mean, so because the and by the way, I'm not talking about individual risks, right? Here, it's really about risks to groups of us, right? And one of the work that I've done also is on how does it look even within the species, right? You guys all know that certain groups are affected more than others for genetic reasons and also because of age, right? Senior folks are more vulnerable to other things. So how do we deal with that? So I'm just questioning the idea of how do you make decisions if you have to make a decision so there's something called uncertain factors in risk assessment. Does anybody know about this? So if you don't know something, there's an uncertainty factor you apply like 3, 5x, or 10x. And I once asked, why do we have 10x? Because someone said we had 10 fingers. Well, no, I'm not making light of this. You guys are laughing about this, but the idea is that the fact that people, it's a risk communication issue, right? So anyway, so let me go to the second thing, laws. People throw that around all the time in terms of decision making. So how should we, but have any of you read the Clean Air Act from first to last word? Nobody, right? In fact, that's the first thing I tell my employees is go read your law. Because it is highly, highly restrictive on how you make decisions, right? So the public and the people who make sustainability decisions are restricted from considering a lot of things already. So the law part of it, so we'll get into more of that with Q&A. But the third thing is, because I'm Western educated, I say this very explicitly, economics is a big deal, right? And when we talk about economics, our society is built on, it's a capitalistic society. We care about money. Do we care about health? We say we do. But when we have to make a decision, what do we consider? How much do we have to pay for it? Who's going to pay for it, right? We don't say, oh, those kids downriver from this. I know that this chemical manufacturer need to put a pollution control equipment in that's going to cost them billions of dollars, but no one ever says that it's going to kill thousands of kids downriver. We do talk about that, but I'll mention that as well as a factor. So I already told you the science and law isn't that hard. I mean, it's really hard. Now I factored in economics, right? Technology. What is doable and not doable? It's actually written into the law in the Clean Water Act, right? The drinking water standards, if you follow the drinking water standards, there are actually 2 standards. Do you guys know what those are? We actually, most of the contaminants that we try to take out of our drinking water systems we can't have that in there at all. It's called maximum contamination limit goal, and it's usually 0. But we regulate to something called maximum contamination limit, not the goal. Because there's no technology to get it to 0. Right? We're already admitting that we can't do it. Even if you paid, remember the economics part I just mentioned, even if you had unlimited resources to pay for it, you just simply cannot take it out of the air or the environment to 0. So there's a technology issue. The other thing is, what is the public willingness to pay? Are you willing to fund EPA to do all this work? ADQ to do all this work? And yesterday we talked about that a bit where the president and Congress gave us $100 billion for EPA to do the work, right? But our entire budget for hiring people to do it is, she mentioned 10 billion, but half of that goes to $5 billion a year for EPA. Do we have enough people to actually do the work? No, right? Let's talk about politics in the United States, and it's global as well. How does the federal government work with the state governments? There's a whole, this is not just an environmental and sustainability issue, but who gets to decide? What do you want? Does Arizona get to decide? This is a constant struggle ever since the founding of our republic, right? In fact, some argue that we actually fought a civil war over it. And so the decision-making, it's not just, and the trade-offs are not just science, law, economics, technology. Also, how we are organized matters in a democratic society, right? So this is really important. Social factors. States that are poor, communities that are poor, communities that are ethnically diverse versus not. It matters. This is where environmental equity and justice issues come in, right? So sometimes we have to make a trade-off to protect some people who are getting kind of an overburden, they're overburdened because of pollution versus another, right? And vice versa. And we have to make those choices between all the factors that I just mentioned to you. And finally, believe it or not, and I think Supreme Court follows this direction, which is we all do, is the notion of public values and opinions. That's changed over time, right? On other issues, social issues as well, on the environment. This is where people talk about climate optimism and pessimism. Do you believe that climate change is man-caused or not? It matters, right? That's why we haven't been able to do mitigation for decades when we knew the science, right? Scientists have been saying for a long time that we need to take action before, as Peter Schlosser always talks about, that we've almost gone over the cliff. Does he ever say we've gone over the cliff? Maybe he does. But anyway, so the bottom line is it matters, right? But what all of this, the reason that I'm mentioning all of this is that this leads us to make second best solutions. Because we're actually going to tell you that we won't be able to do the best solution. But then the question is, how do you know what the best solution is? So I'm posing these questions because people talk about sustainability at the School of Sustainability and others about if we could just get to zero waste, negative carbon, if we could use more lithium, solves the problem. Lithium mining, let me just talk about that because I saw our tribal leaders protesting about the permitting issues and so on. So there's no doubt that people like me at Department of Energy and others are going to want to approve the permit to do lithium mining. I have no feelings one way or another about that. But what I do know, and you should all know, that mining has always been a negative environmental activity. We've never been able to solve that. If you go to Colorado, it's littered with mining sites that's been abandoned, that's polluting. In our lifetime, we've never been able to address that issue. So what this means, if the permit goes through, is that we're accepting that. Is it good or okay? It's not a good or a bad thing. It's that it is a second best solution, right? Because without lithium, we do not have a transition to the clean energy future that we, at least the technology allows us today. Best decision based on what we know. I mean, that's the arguments that we hear about, right? So PFAS, let me just, and then I'll kind of toss it out for more conversation amongst all of you. But so PFAS is one of the most, I think the first lecture, what did I talk about? DDT, right? DDT was the chemical that I talked about. PFAS is what people call emerging pollutant, right? I call BS on that. It's been around since 1940s, but we love that chemical because it had characteristics and features of it that allowed us to make our life so much easier and better and more protective, right? And I can just tell you the kinds of things that it's in. So this is just an indication of why it's been such a beneficial thing, right? So it's in cleaning products, nonstick cookware. It really resists, so it separates moisture and grease away from products, right? So it has water resistant fabric. I believe many of you wear them. I do too, right? And stain resistant carpet. You love the fact that you can spill red wine and wipe it up, right? Personal care products, it's in your shampoo. Take a look. By the way, just my editorial, shampoo, you should always look at your shampoo. It's highly under reviewed products before you use, by the way. Cosmetics, right? Food packaging contains PFAS, because you can see why you wouldn't want certain grease products to be next to, getting into the firefighting. Everyone knows that. That's why there's a lot of around military installations where they do firefighting with actual real foam as opposed to fake foam practices that they have them. Building materials, refrigerants, football fields, artificial turf. I mean, every time I see these guys, I'm thinking, okay, 6 ppd and PFAS exposure, all right? Okay, this is what happens in the sustainability when you know a little too much. So, semiconductors and batteries contain PFAS. Medical devices, catheters, needles. I mean, medical devices are, there are a lot of chemicals that protects and sort of sanitary needs are critical. Sterilization. Medicines also contain PFAS. And in cars, there are PFAS, and obviously aerospace equipment, and even cellular data networks contain PFAS. So it's everywhere, right? But here's the thing. These things were not being regulated as for all of these things at once, right? So I go back to the law. EPA doesn't regulate pharmaceuticals, right? EPA regulates only certain types of things. So some other agency so there's a lot of fragmentation on this. The other is, when someone says forever something, it used to be a great thing. Do you guys remember, at least in my vintage, people would say, hey, it's a forever thing. You can keep it forever. I'm like, wow, that's a great invention. But what that means when a chemical is forever is that it's forever in the environment, right? And that's what PFAS is, right? But the science on this is very difficult. So there's two things. So I'll talk about the science and law. The law in the United States require us to make sure that we have scientific evidence that is linking a particular chemical to a particular harm, right? So how do we rely then? How do we make that decision? We have to also rely on the scientific evidence, which I just talked about in terms of doing risk assessments, right? How do we know that PFAS is, now there's been a lot of studies now. That's why we're talking about it, because we know now that there are actual reproductive effects and carcinogenic effects associated with PFAS. So, but we're still challenged now, because as I mentioned to you, it's not the weight of the evidence, but also cleaning technologies, detection technologies that's needed, because it's what we're finding also is the scientists are telling us it's everywhere. It's in soil, right? It's in water, it's in air. And you can't even like digest or I'm always riding my bike or running, and I noticed that we have a lot of particulate matter in Phoenix area. So everything that's in the soil, for instance, if there's PFAS, I'm breathing it, right? So I think about these kinds of things, but it's not just because of my thinking that we should regulate this particular chemical. Is that we have to demonstrate for everyone, because there's a cost associated with this, because this stuff is actually meant to be a good substance, but no longer. So we're really at a point where, again, how do we determine what to do with things like this? So anyway, so the moral of the story is that the 4 ways that I know, and I'll conclude with this, that we know that we deal with this currently. So what do we do about this? The dilemma that I'm suggesting that we make these trade-offs and we're forever going to have negative impacts on the environment is, one, currently what we do is we monitor, we react, and we fix. That's what we're going to do with PFAS. That's what we do with lead in gasoline, right? Once we find out, by the way, everyone knew lead was bad before we started putting lead in gasoline. Again, there was a decision to be made. How do you make the fuel more efficient? And that's what the lead additive was about, right? MTBE was the second thing that so if you don't know this, you should just Google. But MTBE was another substance we required manufacturers to add to gasoline. What we turned out was that got into the drinking water system, the water systems, and we made the wrong decision. History is full of decisions like that, unintended consequences. But we knew about them. The other is people talk about something called precaution, right? They say, hey, we may not know as much, but we know what if we're wrong about this, what is the potential outcome? So if someone said, this is a forever chemical, what is it that you would do? Or a climate change, this is where the huge discussion about the precautionary principle discussion was. If the outcome is so dramatic that it is irreversible if it happens, then would you be willing to live less certainty about some science or change the regulation in a certain way to do that? Now that's the Europeans have taken that approach on the chemical side. By the way, it's a REACH process, REACH. It's an acronym. If you Google, you'll be able to think about what, and we disagree. The Americans, by the way, disagree with the Europeans on that approach, precaution. The other thing that the economists love is compensation. Actually, a lot of the tribes in the United States are starting to talk about this. Well, if you're gonna do this, and we know that you have to do it, you need to compensate us for this. The Pacific Northwest tribes, actually, were you there at the NSS conference? And the tribal chairman of the Suquamish tribe actually said that. He said, look, we know that we need to have offshore wind farms. It's going to have an impact on our way of life. It's going to have an impact on fisheries and so on. But we also understand that this also meets our goal of reducing climate changing gases, and we would like to support it, but we also want to be compensated for the trade-off that you're making. Reasonable. The last thing is, instead of regulating, one of the things that we also use that EPA and other people have done is, well, we know we're gonna allow certain things to happen, right? But can we work with people or deter people from those negative things happening? Highly speculative, but at the same time, it's only worked in certain places, but the idea is, can we voluntarily have people deal with the negative outcomes in a positive way? Because we know that we're making trade-offs, right? So anyway, so I've talked way too long because the whole purpose was to have a dialogue about this, but I think we have like 15 minutes now. So I'll stop there and either take questions or any comments that you might have on this. No stimulation at all.
Cool. Okay. Well, hopefully we can have a discussion then.
Yeah.
Does anyone have a burning question right now for Ed, Jana? I have some too, so. I'm going to sneak a question.
Yeah, you should. How do you sleep?
Oh, so this is where I used to say that the second assumption that I always make is that, I would always say to myself, no one's going to die if I make a wrong decision. But it turns out that it's not a right or wrong decision. I've come to realization for myself that it's not a right or wrong decision. And I would say there are a few decisions that I would say, had I known what this consequence, that a lot of times we just don't know what the negative, how the magnitude of it, right? This is where the information and the science comes in, is that how do you anticipate the potential negative outcome? and the magnitude of that, because we're making the trade-offs. And I hate saying it this way. It's really a benefit cost analysis, right? Trying to figure out what in totality, factoring in all of these things, social factors, political factors, and all of that. And by the way, this is also why elections are important, because in the United States, the risk management decisions, as you can see, is not always in the scientists. In fact, it shouldn't be in the hands of scientists or lawyers, right? So what I would nebulously call risk managers in the United States are the people that you elect into office, because they make those choices and they tell you what the choices that they're going to make in their campaigns, right? So that's the thing. And as a senior person at EPA, in general, that's what I do. Is we have a calibration, right? We work with our political leaders and others to kind of figure out, okay, what weight do you give these things? And so what I would say is that it's not about my feelings, but have I communicated that adequately to the public, right? Have we shared all the benefits and all the costs? And I think we do, I say, an average job of that, because most people don't care, or people who do care, I think don't get all the information, right? We even have, like Freedom of Information Act, and people ask us for, how did you make these decisions? But I think people need to do more of that, because that'll also drive how we make decisions, because we'll be in a fishbowl. I always say, if you're a public servant, you should be in a fishbowl, right? The idea is that I should be able to tell you, even if you disagree. I mean, the lithium mining thing in this, currently that's going on, is very transparent. You all know what it's going to do to the mining sites, and you all know what can be done and what the impacts are on the tribes, because they tell you, and then the history of it. But you also know what the benefits are, or what would happen without lithium, right? So I think this is but the transparency, that kind of transparency is so important, and that'll make me feel better if I'm able to share all that with everyone.
Now the real question.
That was a softball?
That was the hard question. How do you
I don't. Oh, you have to. That's another thing, is that one of the things that I tell students who ask me about this is that not making a decision, which a lot of people do, is worse, because you can't then share. This is where the transparency comes in. If you don't make a decision, you don't have to share anything. And to me, that's what allows me to sleep. In fact, I sleep really well. As soon as I get to hit the pillow, I don't need any medication for sleeping.
Thanks. And I think that your most recent answer probably gets at a lot of this, but I appreciated your discussion of scientific uncertainty that's involved in EPA decisions. I'm wondering also about, and you discussed elections, the role of political uncertainty, and how that's changed over your time at EPA. I guess I have a lot of discussions about this with my fiance's father, who's also been at the EPA for a few decades, except on the Clean Air Act side. And he talks about how recently, in the past few administration changes, there's been a lot of flip-flops in terms of bureaucratic operations in the EPA, of new kind of like political influences where there weren't political influences before. And I guess how that political uncertainty doesn't just affect EPA operations, but also downstream in terms of the users and actors that are affected by EPA regulations, who have to take into account that political uncertainty all the way through kind of the bureaucratic system.
So when people talk about political influence, one of the things that I always talk about is, well, why is there political influence on one side or another, right? I think in a regulatory agency, I would just simply, maybe it's because of my economics background, we determine the winners and losers. That's a whole lot, the trade-off idea, right? So it doesn't matter. I mean, well, we can have a side conversation about the ideology piece, but I think in general, most of it is driven by the fact that who pays. Because at the regulatory agencies, every decision that we make, and that's why we do analysis to support our regulations, right? And what we talk about is actually how much it's going to cost and who's going to have to pay. And more likely than not, those people who are going to have to pay are going to resist paying that. That's just the reality of it, right? So then they'll try to lobby people and try. I mean, so I think that's a natural behavior. So I try not to, as a public servant, not to judge that because that's our process, right? But what we need to be, this is why it's important to be very transparent that in the decision-making process is that why are you imposing that cost on someone? Well, because they did some environmental damage, right? That's hurting other people. That's what the whole idea of payment and compensation is, right? That's what our regulatory system is based, polluter pays. And that's also related to deterrence I mentioned earlier, that if we are able to do that, and that's where the change is actually, I wouldn't call it political, but it's really confusing in the marketplace when you flip-flop because no clarity. A lot of companies will actually say, hey, yeah, we don't, we would prefer not to pay, but we would like better certainty that if we're going to pay, that we need to figure out when and how long, let us do that and give us time to meet our regulatory requirement. That's the conversation that I think we all need to have. Because when we just talk about people, that's why I think that decision transparency is so important, because if you take it into the realm of they're just wacky people because they're okay with environmental pollution. I don't think people that, at least the industry people that I deal with, view it that way, right? They just want to make sure that if the law says you have to pay, then we just want to figure out, we don't want you to keep on flipping back and forth. That's why you read about certain companies saying, hey, we're on this side. The other companies are on the other side. So that you see these kind of dialogue also happening. So I think the politics of it, when I say, you have to make sure you go out and vote, is that that's what you're really deciding on. Whose side are they on, right? In terms of, because if you keep on flip-flopping, as we have done in the air regulations from last few years, it's really bad for the economy in my mind. That's the way I see it. So I hope that answered your question.
I'm going to ask a quick question.
Oh,
I
yeah.
never get questions in because I'm always running this around, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how it seems like the US is more risk tolerant to pollution, air, water, pesticides, and so forth than other countries. And if you could talk a little bit towards that. I know the EPA does a lot of that. The FDA has their own stuff too, but it seems like we can put more junk in our food here as well. And then if, as part of that benefit cost analysis, how health costs are accounted for, if at all, and if that's part of our ability to tolerate risk if we're not accounting for these other health costs to us.
So there's a whole field in the kind of the federal cost benefit analysis that spend their entire life trying to figure out how to value human health impacts, human mortality impacts, and so on. And Josh could probably teach like a full year on that subject. But yeah, that's what we're trying to figure out. But let me, so quantification and monetizing I call it monetizing some of these values, right? Is I don't know, Josh, how should I put it? I don't want to say it's a science. Dark art, he says. So you heard it from an expert. But the idea, so for instance, we've tried to put a price of carbon, price of not doing anything about carbon mitigation, right? So we think we come up with numbers like that. And then we also look at the value of avoided human mortality. And I think that number is like $10 million per life or something like that, and that the US uses. But even there, so the idea of what EPA uses is very different than what transportation department uses. And just now I'm going way into the weeds, but EPA uses a higher value of avoided mortality because it's involuntary, right? Whereas people who drive cars, they're taking certain risks themselves. So I think that's right. I mean, so the value is lower because it's really in the weeds. I'm happy to talk more about that. But the culture and societal values also matter a great deal. This is where you're talking about the US versus other people. And I don't think that's a negative thing. I mean, this is where I was talking about the federalism and the states. And so it's a balance, right? I mean, so again, this is another balance that results in a trade-off. So there are certain regulations and policies that US is much more stringent on than, for instance, the Europeans. But a lot of people just talk about the Europeans on certain, like the REACH program is much more aggressive than ours. So chemical side, they're much more precautionary. So the way that they think about it is they want anytime, by the way, we have, I don't know how many, I used to have a number that tells you how many chemicals that we've created since like 1960s. You'll be astonished. And then how many chemicals we actually have tested. So here's the thing. So this is where I think EDF has something on their website about this. But the reason that so until the 2000s, the Europeans and the Americans had a similar protocol. But when the REACH program came into existence, what the Europeans are doing is that the chemical manufacturers now have to demonstrate no harm before it gets into commerce. That's a little different than the American model, right? This is where the trade-off between how useful it is and the potential damage, right, that's a trade-off that people are making because the benefits are so great that sometimes you want to make sure that you could actually put it into commerce before. So without EPA example, let me talk about Dr. Fauci and HIV. So again, I'm revealing my vintage here. People were dying of AIDS. I mean, people were really, this was a serious crisis in this country in the 80s, right? They were taking so long to test the medications. That's what Dr. Fauci, if you guys read his, sort of bio and so he's famous for because he's the one who said, you know what? We may need to get some of these experimental drugs out first, even if we know that we're sure that it's not going to cause damage because so many people are dying. It's a benefit cost trade-off. So did the FDA make the right call? They probably saved a lot of lives, right? But again, they also did not because, so FDA has a very interesting, I mean, this, in terms of this precaution, the issue that you're asking about, FDA's framework is very, very interesting because they have to bring a medication because every medication is toxic. Tylenol is highly toxic. Advil is highly toxic if you don't do it in the right dosage and all that, right? That's why people overdose. That's why we have education programs and so on. But so before it comes to the market, their approach used to be that you would have like 20, 30 years of testing before it comes to the market, right? But in the meantime, all these people that could, be reduced suffering and stuff, it's a generation that you might be missing. So what is the trade-off would you make on that in the process of doing that? So some medications, you never get to a place where that it's completely safe. It's never going to be safe. So I think for the chicken pox vaccine, I should just tell you because I know a person who is 1 in a trillion who suffered from that vaccine, a friend of mine who's crippled for life. But she's taken care for life because they have a fund that's set up because they know what the result is possible. So that there are always trade-offs. So the question is really this idea of benefits and costs. And so it's not as easy either, those decisions, right? So someone who approved FDA, when they approved the chickenpox vaccine, the idea was this is going to save millions of lives, right? But there might be 1 or 2 individuals, which happened to a friend of mine. And the idea, but she's taken care of because they set aside, there's a fund actually for these medications from FDA that sets aside for the possibility of people actually experiencing that 1 in a million or 1 in a trillion possibility of negative consequence. So anyway, I think I hope that's helpful because we could never see it as a right or wrong, or that's why whenever we talk about the Europeans and us, I always think about, okay, so is this the right context? Anyway, Diane.
Hear me? There we go. Okay, great. So I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So those are regulatory trade-offs in reducing scientific uncertainty. And I'm curious about all of the various trade-offs or some of the various trade-offs in allocating resources to reducing uncertainty versus taking action.
Yeah.
So years ago, I worked for a program at the National Science Foundation where we would get proposals focused on ecotoxicology, and we were instructed to reject those proposals without review because that was the domain of the EPA. It's not within
Yeah,
NSF.
that's a
scope.
law piece, right? The authorities, who gets to do
Yeah,
what, yes.
Except that EPA over the years, it seems like whenever the funding is slashed for research, it's never restored.
That's the budget
This
piece.
hole
yes.
in the federal agencies,
Yeah.
and we see it in I think in our area in sustainability, that the federal agencies with the most funding for research, which are DOD, DOE, and NSF, don't fund most of our interests and, the urgent questions in sustainability. So it seems like in terms of reducing scientific uncertainty, the most urgent problems that would help us as a society navigate pollution, climate change, extinction loss, that's not where we're allocating our research dollars.
No.
Can you speak to that trade-off?
Well, so the trade, I mean, I think this is the societal value and norm, right? This is related to what Jenny just asked, is that we, I think, have decided to take the approach of monitor, react, and fix. That's what so if you take that approach, then you are less likely to, in my opinion, again, this is my opinion, right? So to devote research to think about prevention, right? Or, precautionary approaches because of the fact that that's not the way we do things. We don't, and when I say we don't, that's not the way we do things. That's not the way the funding comes and the authorities come, right? And then I'm just making a link that to our values, right? And so that's why I'm having this discussion, because we have this in the sustainability world. People think that, hey, if we have an idealized picture of our society and our decision making, our laws and sciences, that I think we're saying to ourselves that, look, we're going to get to sustainability nirvana. We can get to somehow harmony with nature. And I'm just saying that that's all these constraints that you are describing is really based on who we are. And that's the only thing I'm talking about. I can't judge what a numbered Congress funds. I mean, anyway, I hope that's okay. Okay, she has a question.
Yeah. Sit on.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, super interesting. I mean, I think, when we say we as a society, I think it's really important to kind of disaggregate that and talk a little bit more about power in terms of whose interests are and whose values are being represented in some of these decisions. And I think, it'd be interesting in your experience as we, weigh different interest groups who are, pushing back against regulation. There's also this, interest groups that don't have active representation. They're kind of abstract, they're statistical, they're future oriented, versus the kind of very present material costs of a particular regulation, affecting a particular industry. And so how do you perceive the kind of who's the we and who's the value, and how are we as a society thinking about that? Because I think that's something that's really challenging for getting around some of these issues.
So I think it's related to Josh's first question at my first seminar, which is, what do we teach our students going forward, right? What is the critical set of skills, right? And the two things I would say is, because it's a sustainability program, we're all about systems thinking, right? But if I could extrapolate for myself on that, I would think about talking about transparency, right? And then the transparency is, who is it for? I mean, who's the participant in this? In my 40-year career working, I would say things have improved a lot. That's where the optimism is, right? The fact that I hear the voice of our tribal leaders, it wasn't like that when I started, right? The fact that I see colleagues who look like me and who are involved in the process. I see a lot more women. I can actually tell you in my EPA career that we have over 50% of our leaders are women. Makes a huge difference. When I joined EPA, less than 10 out of 300. That's in my lifetime. So what you're talking about is, to me, I think there's a huge, tremendous progress that's made. But I think what continued involvement to me is making sure that people's voices are heard, not just at community meetings, but being in our organization and being people who are involved in process. I mean, if you look at, I don't know, your personal career journey, your journey, but in my journey, I've seen this huge transformation of our society. That's why we can even talk about this. And you're part of this, because in my journey, when I started, there was no sustainability. Nobody even talked about that. There wasn't even an environmental career. That's why Josh and me and other people, well, Josh is already, he's more specialized, but like there was no environmental economics, environmental policy, and most people of my vintage did not study environmental regulations. We just came to it because of our calling, right? So I think, to me, that's the way I see it, is that, so those of us who are in, this is why I'm having this conversation, is I want people to understand how we make these decisions, make it more transparent so that people get more involved. And this is my way of addressing Josh's first question, is how do we now engage each other with students and faculty to actually understand what the reality of what we do, and how do we then prepare our students to talk about this? And I know that's a long-winded answer, but I think that I have a significant, and to me, this is one area that I'm really optimistic about our sustainability and society going forward, is that I think I feel like the sustainability world is maturing also. We all need to mature, right? So 20 years, how long has the sustainability program in place here? 18 years? Oh, you're still a baby, right? So this is what I'm saying. So the idea of getting into the reality and talking about this, I think, is really important. That's why I thought that the quality discussion as opposed to quantity was more important today. But anyway, thanks for the question. I appreciate that.
Yeah, let's clap. We're gonna wrap it up because we have students trying to come in for their class. So thank you, Ed, again, for doing another seminar for us and leading a great discussion. Our next seminar is in for about a month, November 6th. We'll have Moksha Kal presenting, and it'll be up in 560, but we'll make sure that's clear on the invite. So thanks everyone for coming. There is food at the back, so please stay and grab some and chat a little bit longer with Ed.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. Have a good fall break.